Okay. Hi, everybody. Let me get my slides going here first. And there we go. Okay. Well, tonight we're going to talk about two topics that I think strike really close to home to a lot of people. Maybe not everybody. Just like there's a possibility that last week we talked about money. It's possible that there's somebody out there who doesn't worry about money. But tonight we're going to talk about a couple of topics that can create a lot of heated emotions and anxiety. So first, we're going to talk about politics, which has really ratcheted up dramatically over the past couple of years. And then we'll talk about family. Those closest to our hearts can cause us a lot of worry. Well, you know what? I really think it's an interesting and landmine-filled topic, politics. And when we're going to combine that, of course, with talking about religion. So that's pretty dangerous territory. And who do I think I am? But I'm not going to tread too lightly. Extremely polarized political agendas and social media that operates in bytes rather than in paragraphs and in pages, and headlines that scream for our attention and that tell half-truths and use and rely on innuendo. And then our attention spans that seem to shrink by the day because our minds have been rewired by our devices. Bumper stickers that blurt out two-word answers as if that's all it could be, and it must just be so obvious to everyone. All of these things, in a very calculated way, pull at our natural inclinations, either to the left or to the right. 30 or 40 years ago, I think we would have been likely to look at moral decay and political issues, and we would have said that there are one or two more signs that Christ's return must be near. Today, and this may be my imagination, but it feels to me as though we are more likely to worry instead. And that worry then turns into complaining. And that complaining then turns into outrage. Again, thanks in large part to social media that allows us and aids us and abets us in the outing of our true selves. It's so easy to say something on Facebook that 30 years ago, it wasn't even an option. This is 2019, and last year when I was first looking and developing these topics about worry, it was exactly 40 years after the taking of Jerusalem. And it was 70 years after the State of Israel was founded. And yet, this past May, which was the actual 70th anniversary of the founding of Israel, I saw very few of us reflecting about those dates and what they might mean about Jesus' return. Instead, these are the things that we were focused on last summer, and to some extent are still focused on. Tariffs and trade wars, the on-again, off-again summit with North Korea, which of course there was another one just last week, and that was big news. Immigration and the effects of policy enforcement on families and children. We were focused on a president's lack of diplomacy. We were focused on a president's fidelity or infidelity. on a first lady's presence or absence, on what the first lady wore. You remember what a big deal that was? On what white supremacists and counter-protesters were up to. That's a favorite topic where I'm from. I live in Charlottesville, Virginia. We were focused on the LGBTQ agenda, on climate change or global warming, whichever you prefer to call it, on school shootings and on gun control. Did I miss anything? But we don't talk about or focus very much on the return of Jesus, our King. Instead, we worry and we publicly proclaim our political preferences, and we lambaste each other again, thanks to social media and all that it has done to our minds, in ways that we simply couldn't have done 30 years ago. We worry, sometimes about things that could affect us personally, like what's happening to healthcare and what's happening to insurance. Will the stock market melt down again like it did in 2008? What if a gunman comes into my kid's school? And sometimes we worry about things that are far more distant from us personally, like our southern border and what's happening there, the caginess of North Korea, the potential impact of the potential next Supreme Court justice. That was more big news at the time. And I will confess that I cannot relate to any of these worries. I don't know why, but it just doesn't get me riled up one way or the other. If I see 4 or more talking heads on a TV screen at one time, I will turn the channel immediately. I don't even need to know the topic. I just know that I will hate the rhetoric, and the impatience, and the talking over each other. In fact, it's so true that politics does not cause me to worry that it didn't even cross my mind to add this to the topics that we would talk about until pretty late in my preparations. I just didn't even connect those pretty obvious dots, or dots that are pretty obvious to some people. Maybe that's because I'm blessed to be fairly insulated from the effects of most of these worries personally. Most of them, not all of them, at least today. So I am either the ideal person or absolutely the wrong person to talk about this. So instead of giving any opinions about what we should or shouldn't do or feel, or whether we should even relate to political topics at all, let's instead revisit some of the things that we've already discussed, but this time through the lens of politics. We know that the religious leaders at the time of Jesus worried. It says, then the chief and the Pharisees called a meeting of the Sanhedrin. What are we accomplishing, they asked. Here's this man performing many signs. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him, and then the Romans will come and take away both our temple and our nation. They were afraid that if they let Jesus go, it would cause the Romans to swoop in, as if they weren't already there in strength. So that was their political worry of the day. Jesus had his own concerns about the political rulers at that time, and they were not distant hypothetical concerns either. Rather, Jesus knew that the rulers were going to kill him. That's simple. They knew that they were going to kill him. It was that cut and dried. But what did he say about the rulers? It's true that he called the Pharisees hypocrites to their faces. And he told the Pharisees that Herod was a fox. And of course, John the Baptist, at moral peril to himself, called Herod out for taking his brother's wife. But what else did Jesus say? He also said we are to render to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. Give the king your money, and give God your heart. And he said to do what the Pharisees tell you to do, but don't do what they do. And Paul tells us to pray for all of our leaders. Why do I get the feeling that a lot of us don't take Paul very seriously when he said that? Because how can we lampoon somebody and then pray for them? To quote James, does pure water and salt water come from the same fountain? Worry didn't play into Jesus's or Paul's thinking about either their religious or their secular political leaders. So why do any of us worry about those things? So I could just open it up for a minute now. Does anybody find that they struggle with this, worrying about politics in some form or other? I saw a hand wave there. What's the worry?
What's your worry? Well, I guess at this time, I worry that Trump is going to end up getting us in a war of some sort. And, that's
Okay.
the main thing right now.
Right. I suppose that could be a valid concern.
But I try to push it away. Because
Yeah, it's hard, isn't it?
I'm not, my worry is not going to change anything.
Yeah, that's true.
I just need to have faith that in God, and He will take care of things, no matter what happens.
Right.
But we are supposed to pray, aren't we, for those who have authority over us?
Right.
Yeah. That's one thing that I worried about. I've had three cousins born this last year that were born prematurely. Like they would be my third cousins, and two twins. They weighed less than 3 pounds each. Actually, when they were born, the little boy weighed 2 pounds, and the little girl weighed 1 pound, 14 ounces. And I just had and they're doing great now. They're like 14 or 15 pounds. June 3rd, actually. And they're beautiful. These beautiful little babies. I've seen pictures, my mom emails them to me. And my little cousin Ruthie was just born prematurely. She weighed 3 pounds, 15 ounces, and she's breathing on her own now. And one thing I worry about a lot is like the normalization of late-term abortion. People are pushing to allow babies to just let them die after they're born and leave them on the table and slip their spinal cords and stuff like that. That's worrisome to me, and I pray against it quite a bit. But and I pray for our political leaders to honor the whole "thou shalt not kill" thing. I mean, I've heard testimonies from a woman who used to work in an abortion clinic. She said you could see on the ultrasound machine that the baby was fighting to get away from the abortion instrument, fighting for its own life inside its mother's womb. And how can you? Anyway, I pray for these unborn babies quite a bit, and there's pray that the veil be lifted. Like babies, God gave us life through our parents. Just the way I feel about it. And I think the Bible teaches the same thing. But it's something that even though like Philippians 4, 6, and 7 tells me not to worry, I find myself praying about that quite a bit.
All right, I agree with you. It amazes me that could even that could even be a possibility. The forms of abortions that they're talking about now, without batting an eye, it amazes me.
Yeah, they were like celebrating in New York and lighting up the sky. Stuff like that. It seems like, anyway, I talked a little bit, the spirit of Herod seems to be really prevalent. And Pharaoh, for that matter. But anyway, I don't want to take up the whole night. We could probably go on for, forever about that, about life and death. Anyway.
Well, you talked about your those little babies that were born into your family, and we're going to talk a little bit about family now. So let me go back to sharing my screen. Oops, press the right button. There we go. Oops. Back up, back up. What parent doesn't worry about their child? When they're really young, we can worry about every sniffle, whether they're developing properly, or whether they're eating, or they're sleeping okay, and whether we're somehow doing something wrong according to any one of 100 parenting books. And as they get a bit older, we can worry about how they get along with their friends, or whether they even have friends, and how they're fitting in, and whether they're generally doing well in school. We may worry about whether they're in the top 10% of their class, or the top half, or getting by at all. The fact that we can worry about them, even when they're doing well, is proof that we will worry about our kids no matter what. And as they get older still, we worry about the friends they keep, what they're doing when they're not at home, and whether our positive influences and those of our church are outweighing everything else from the rest of their days and their weeks that aren't so positive. And as they get older still, and as they make choices of their own, choices that we may not agree with, or may not even begin to be able to understand, our anxiety can shoot through the roof. Particularly if we find that we have to somehow be intertwined with those very strange choices. We may worry about whether they'll be able to make a life on their own. And are they physically healthy? Are they emotionally okay? Are they making solid, healthy choices? Are they pulling their own weight, or at least trying to? Are they taking responsibility? Are they even capable of taking responsibility? Are they mentally healthy? And if not, will they ever be? Will there ever be an end to this, whatever it is at the time? Well, there can be no end to those types of worries. And those worries may only get bigger the older the child gets, well into adulthood. Indeed, we may worry about a family member, whether it's a parent or a child or a sibling or anyone that we're close to who may have particular challenges, whether they're physical or mental or spiritual. And that can in turn create challenges for us that we never dreamed of having to deal with. And through it all, while we're worrying about them, we're also, if we're being honest, possibly feeling sorry for ourselves that we're having to deal with these things. Life is messy. And it's sobering to remember, and this doesn't apply to all situations, but it's sobering to remember that Jesus said this: "Don't suppose that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I did not come to bring peace but a sword, for I have come to turn a man against his father, a daughter against her mother, a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. A man's enemies will be the members of his own household." And to compound it all, we don't tend to share the bigger problems that we have in our families with each other. Everybody puts on their best Sunday go-to-meeting face. And so we think we must be the only one dealing with the problem. Sunday morning, you go to church. Hi, how are you? I'm fine. How about you? Well, what's the source of that? Is it pride? Or is it embarrassment? So what happens is it appears that everybody else is doing well. Their kids are excelling in school and at sports and have lots of good, healthy friendships. Marriage is great. Everybody is physically, mentally, spiritually, and fiscally healthy. Life is great, just great for everybody except for you. Or so it seems. I don't know about you, but I was raised, I guess, in a very sheltered way. I had no clue about family troubles of any sort among members of my church as I was growing up. Looking back, there were some strange things, but I was always given the impression, perhaps by my very German family, that these people just needed to straighten up and fly right, to pull themselves up by their own bootstraps, to get in line, and probably a few other hack phrases that aren't practical. I didn't know anything about mental illness or family disagreements, heartache. And maybe that's the way it should be for a kid, probably is. But at the same time, it gave me the impression that I could simply control how things turned out with the people in my life simply by my force of will. And just by staying away from strange people. The Bible says, train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. I'm curious. Are we to take this as a hard and fast rule? Solomon, when he said that, may have been speaking about himself, because a case can be made that he, of course, was raised by David, and he turned his back on the way that he was raised, but then when he was older, he turned back to it. But you know, David had a lot of children with all those wives. And the same is certainly true of Solomon with his 700 wives and 300 concubines. Right there, we know he probably didn't do a great job of raising his kids very well. David didn't do well with the children of his harem either. We know children who have left God and have never returned. If our children depart, did we fail? God raises us. And how many of us do well? So let's take a few minutes to consider some of the times that worry about a family member raises its head in the Gospels. 40 days after Jesus' birth, the family went to Jerusalem for his dedication and for Mary's purification. At that time, the old man Simeon was there, and it had been revealed to him that he wouldn't die until he saw the Messiah. So in the midst of this wonderful blessing he gives to Mary, he also says to her, "A sword will pierce your heart also." You know, we just read over that. But imagine if you were told that about yourself and your child. That something about your child, when he or she grew, would cause you the worst possible pain. We're told that Mary pondered the things she saw and heard about Jesus in her heart. This heart that would be pierced. Did she worry? Well, how could she not? Maybe daily for 33 years. It could have been like a cancer eating away at her until her worst possible fears came true. And this is Mary, who was blessed above all women. Mary, who was blessed above all women, was given this thought to carry with her through Jesus' life. You know, why didn't Simeon just stay quiet or not say that? We'll talk more about this topic next week. When Jesus was still very young and the family was living in Egypt, we're told after Herod died, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt and said, "Get up, take the child and his mother and go to the land of Israel, for those who were trying to take the child's life are dead." So he got up, took the child and his mother, and went to the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was reigning in Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. Having been warned in a dream, he withdrew to the district of Galilee, and he went and lived in a town called Nazareth. What form did this fear take? It's so easy for us to think, how afraid could or should Joseph have been? If we even notice that he was afraid when we read this. Because again, we just gloss right over it. Do we gloss over it? But how afraid was he, really? After all, Joseph has spoken with angels. And he's raising the Messiah, who certainly isn't going to get killed at this stage of his life, right? And that's logic. In fact, the Messiah isn't going to be killed ever, is he? According to what Joseph would have been thinking, probably. Certainly what the common understanding at the time was. But even though Joseph understood these things, he was afraid. It looks like the family may have had plans to go back and settle in Bethlehem. After all, wouldn't that have made sense to fulfill all prophecy? But Joseph's fear was the driving force that God used to ensure that they moved back to Nazareth. God used that fear. And aren't we really just like Joseph? At least in this way. He knew he was raising the Messiah, but he was still afraid. We know all sorts of things, don't we? I don't think we'd be here today if we didn't know all sorts of things. We know God has a plan. We know that God has called each one of us. We know that the kingdom is near. But does any of that stop us from worrying about our families, or our bills, or our worthiness, or our health? Well, of course it doesn't. The depth of our faith in these things that we know may soften the anxiety, but it doesn't eliminate. So when we read a story like this and say, well, he shouldn't have felt that way, we do a great disservice to the man, and we make things two-dimensional and antiseptic. Joseph was a good and righteous man. Two-dimensional stories and characters are not the real world, and they don't reflect how human minds work. And so Joseph, in spite of all he knew, was afraid. and that's real. And of course, when Jesus stayed behind in the temple at the age of 12, his parents told him, "We were anxiously searching for you." Well, of course they were. We can only try to imagine the panic they felt. Put yourself in their position with all the technology we have at our disposal today. Gone. Any one of us would have been frantic. But they don't have the option of cell phones, and they don't have the ability to helicopter in constant contact. They didn't have police. They didn't have Amber Alerts. Imagine their hysteria. And they didn't even have cars to get back to Jerusalem in a reasonable period of time. With all the time it took to get back to Jerusalem, they probably weren't able to go to the police and put out an APB with photos. Though admittedly, all of those things we have at our disposal today might only add to our anxiety because we've lost all patience and we expect answers immediately. If your kid doesn't text you back immediately, something terrible must have happened, right? But really, we know this story so well, and the gospel writers share it in so few words that it's easy for us to say, "Oh, I'll bet they were worried," and not really sense just how panicked they must have been. Can you imagine? Can you even begin to put yourself in their position? John 4, starting in verse 43. Now, we won't read it verbatim. There was a royal official, not a Jew, worried about his very sick son. When he learned that Jesus had returned to Galilee, he held out hope. Excuse me. He grasped at the fact that Jesus had returned to Galilee because he had seen what Jesus had done before in Capernaum, the town where he lived. So he knew what Jesus could do and what he had done. The evidence was all around him in the little town. So he went to Cana, where Jesus was. Now, today, we could drive from Capernaum to Cana in 32 minutes, according to Google Maps. But it's 39 miles. This man was desperate. He went to Cana and begged Jesus to come heal his son. "Sir, come down before my child dies." "Go," Jesus replied, "your son will live." And the man believed what Jesus said, and so he left. And he didn't leave to go next door, stick his head in the door and go, "Oh yeah, sure enough, there he is better." He left for the 39-mile walk back home. With what words and with what force did Jesus say this so that the man believed him? But he took Jesus at his word that his son would live, and he started home. Would you have done that? Can we imagine what it would have taken for us to do what this man did? What words Jesus would have had to say to us, and how he would have to say it? And know that is how Jesus would have treated us if we had been in this man's place. Jesus doesn't talk directly to us today. But if we can put ourselves in this man's place, maybe we can begin to know that Jesus would tell us exactly what we needed to hear. It was a full day later when this man met his servants somewhere along the way and learned that it was true. This is one of those stories, again, that we know, and the emotions are not spelled out. But if we stop for a moment, we can imagine. We can put ourselves in his place and imagine. Let's look at Matthew 4 as one of the many places that describes the crowd following Jesus. Jesus went throughout Galilee, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the good news of the kingdom and healing every disease and sickness among the people. News about him spread all over Syria, and people brought to him all who were ill with various diseases, those suffering severe pain, the demon-possessed, those having seizures, and the paralyzed, and he healed them. Large crowds from Galilee, the Decapolis, Jerusalem, Judea, and the region across the Jordan followed him. All right, now stop and let's picture this for a moment. Think about this. Large crowds from all over Israel, and all over Israel. Now again, they weren't hopping in their cars. And even from up into Syria. That's interesting. They heard about what he could do. They knew what he could do. And they believed that he could do it. They dropped their everyday lives and came from miles, from days around, and followed Jesus. These were people living hand to mouth. But they dropped everything. Why? Because he was healing, really, truly healing every disease and sickness. They brought with them from miles and days away all who were ill with various diseases, those suffering severe pain, the demon-possessed, those having seizures, and the paralyzed. The paralyzed. And no doubt everything in between. Think about it. They didn't hop in a car and drive there. They walked. Maybe a few of them had a donkey and a cart. And they dragged these people in various states of illness and weakness and psychosis with them. Their children, their parents, their spouses, their brothers and sisters. These poor creatures who were completely dependent on them and who received no real medical care. There was no such thing. These people who were without hope. Can we even begin to feel the anxiety now mixed for the first time ever with a little bit of hope? Can we begin to feel what that was like? This feeling that pulsed through this massive crowd. These people that followed Jesus everywhere he went and took their poor, sick family members with them. The diseased, the paralyzed. Really? The paralyzed? The epileptics, the badly injured, the disfigured, those in severe, relentless pain, the depressed, the psychotic, the schizophrenic, along with a good many lepers hovering around the periphery of the crowd because they weren't allowed to get close. Put yourself there. Strip away the shred of hope that modern medicine gives us. Strip away the bank accounts and the credit cards and the grocery stores and the restaurants and electricity and heat and air conditioning and cars and hotels and comfortable beds. Okay? Now, who would you want to take to Jesus? Would you be able to do it? How would you do it? Where would your mind be? How much anxiety was coursing through this crowd, both among the sick and their family members? We can say the same for the woman who followed Jesus and begged him, so much so that his disciples wanted her to just go away. Can you imagine? She was relentless. It says Jesus withdrew to the region of Tyre and Sidon. A Canaanite woman from that vicinity came to him crying out, "Lord, Son of David, have mercy on me. My daughter is demon-possessed and suffering terribly." Jesus did not answer a word. So his disciples came to him and urged him, "Send her away, but she keeps crying after us." He answered, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of Israel." The woman came and knelt before him. "Lord, help me," she said. He replied, "It's not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs." "Yes, it is, Lord," she said. "Even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table." Then Jesus said to her, "Woman, you have great faith. Your request is granted." And her daughter was healed at that moment. "Lord, Son of David, have mercy on me. My daughter is demon-possessed and suffering terribly." What do you think? Was she worried? And yet in the midst of this heartfelt plea, even in the midst of her anguish, Jesus tested her. It doesn't seem fair, does it? Because at first he didn't answer her. But she was relentless. So much so, in fact, that the disciples told him to send her away. What's that about? Were they so insular, convinced that Jesus belonged only to the Jews, that they would actually heartlessly turn against her rather than join her in begging Jesus to heal her little girl? Jesus seems to feed this by saying it wouldn't be right for him to help anybody who wasn't from Israel. Is he testing her still further? Yes, it would seem so. Because what's her answer? She says, "Oh, yes, it is right. Even a dog like me should get crumbs." What great faith. But it's interesting and it's instructive to see that Jesus pushes her and tests her as if having a sick child wasn't test enough. Can anybody here relate to that? And then we have the father of the epileptic. I hardly need to say anything about him. He was truly desperate, and he was truly humble in his faith. How many of us have echoed his words when in the deepest despair over one of our own family members? "Help, I believe, Lord, help my unbelief." I'd like us to notice something from the story of Legion, the man who lived among the tombs. You know, he had a family, and I can imagine that they worried about him tremendously. I can picture them bringing him food every day and, trying to talk to him and bring him some comfort. This was a little area. This was not some huge city, and he didn't live on one side and they on the other. It's a small area, and they were right there, and they would have worried about him constantly, and they would have probably seen him every day. And Jesus knew this. This is one of those things that is proof to me of the inspiration of the Bible. It's one of those things where you wouldn't see it if you weren't feeling the need for it. As Jesus was getting into the boat, the man who had been demon-possessed begged to go with him. But Jesus didn't let him, but said, "Go home to your own people and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and how he has had mercy on you." That tells me that Jesus knew that Legion had family at home who worried about him. And he took the time to care about them. So that's the end of what I have for this evening. Anybody have any comments or your own thoughts about worry, either about politics or about family?
I was just wondering if you had any thoughts as to why he tested the woman.
I'm sorry, why he what? Why he tested her?
Woman, the Samaritan woman.
Yeah, I don't know. It seems amazing to me that, I mean, it really does almost seem unfair, doesn't it? I don't know.
I'm just thinking out
The only
loud.
thing I can think of is that if as we notice that, it can give us some comfort that when we're begging for Jesus to heal, or we're begging for something that we believe seems perfectly acceptable and in keeping with what could be God's will, and we don't get the answer that we're looking for, that we can look at this and see that, yeah, maybe, Jesus didn't answer right away, but he pushed harder, but eventually he did answer.
The lesson may also have been for his disciples, because they were part of this communication. They were part of the conversation regarding the woman, and they had taken a side that was contrary to Jesus' ultimate action. He may have played into their argument for a moment, to bring the story to them as well, which is to say to us.
Yeah, that's a good point. He let them kind of dig their own grave a little bit by just not saying anything at first. And they must have thought, well, Jesus doesn't want to have anything to do with her. We must be right in our thinking that he's just for us.
The lesson beyond the woman herself is to go beyond the community, to spread the faith beyond, outward. And by his example, it was done.
Right. That's a really good point.
It seemed like he always did. Yeah, that makes perfect sense to me, because he always knew exactly what everybody was thinking. He was able to discern everyone's thoughts before they said anything. That makes, I enjoyed that answer.
Yeah.
But I was curious about like the next stories, or about, for instance, the man said, "My name is Legion, for we are many." I always read that to mean that was the name of the spirits that were cast out. Or that was that. I don't know if that's a wrong interpretation, or how much it even matters in the long run. But
That's poetry.
because of, okay.
It seems like schizophrenia, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does, because
He got a lot of voices in his head.
yeah, and they all went into a herd of swine. I don't know how, like, those 2,000.
Yeah, we looked at a couple of weeks ago. We looked at that, the impact of that on the townspeople, because they saw that, and they didn't focus on the healing. They focused on the fact that their livelihood was destroyed. And so they begged Jesus to just leave them, just go away. Has anybody found that they've been able to somehow reduce their worries about family? Not that things have gotten better, but that you found that you're able to deal with it better today somehow than you were?
That's true. You do learn how to deal with it better.
I'm sorry, I'm having trouble hearing you.
You still worry, but you learn how to deal with it better.
Part of the lesson is that the worry doesn't help.
Right, compounds problems. And I like mixing that Proverbs 3 and 5 along with that Philippians 4, 6, and 7. Trust in the Lord with all thine heart and not on your own understanding. Acknowledge him in all thy ways and he will direct thy path.
Right. You know, how much is worry a sign that we're trying to be in control rather than recognizing that God has it. He knows what's going on.
Yeah,
Yeah.
most things are way out of our control anyway. So,
Yeah.
What is it, 90% of the things we worry about?
so probably, yeah.
Well, next week we'll try to bring some closure to this topic because, you know, so far we've been looking at lots of examples of worry, and we've looked at the things that Jesus did or said, or most frequently actually didn't say. But we see how much he was exposed to worry. And next week, we're going to try to bring some closure to it by talking about peace and about blessings. So we'll go ahead and close for tonight. Father, thank you for your scriptures. Thank you for opening your word to us and helping us to dive in and see things that we may not naturally see as we simply read a story at its surface. But we appreciate the depths of your scriptures, that in so few words we can turn the story around and look at it from different angles. And we've been focusing on worry, and we can see worry throughout so much of the Gospels, and can appreciate that you understand, and that certainly Jesus, having walked just as we do, and much more intensely, understands our worries. We appreciate that, and we are thankful that we have your plan to hold on to, and our understanding that you love us and you love our families. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Well, thank you once again, Casey, tonight. We appreciate it very much. And many of us will see you next week. Some of us may or may not. So there we
All right.
go.
You be that way, Ray.
Yeah. All right. Good night.
Thanks a lot. Good night, everybody.
Bye. Night.